Never in American history had a group seized the streets, the squares, the sacrosanct business thoroughfares, and the marbled halls of government to protest and proclaim the unendurability of their oppression. This week is a special Shabbat. There are a number of special Shabbats throughout the year. We are a few weeks away from Shabbat Shekalim. After comes Shabbat Zachor. Before Passover, we have Shabbat Hagadol. This week, we observe Shabbat Tzedek. You might not have heard of this one. Unlike the others, Shabbat Tzedek is a new tradition. Tzedek, for those that may not know, is the Hebrew word for justice. This special Shabbat is the product of our Reform movement, and it occurs each year in memory of the author of the quote I just read, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. While Monday is a federal holiday, his birthday is today, January 15th. He was born 92 years ago today. In a different world, he might still be alive today. What would he be saying today? Before I continue, a word about that opening quote, about a group seizing the streets, the businesses, the marbled halls of government. Dr. King wrote those words in reference to the mass protests in 1963 that served as a turning point in the civil rights movement. Dr. King goes on to explain, just as lightning makes no sound until it strikes, the Negro Revolution generated quietly. But when it struck, the revealing flash of its power and the impact of its sincerity and fervor displayed a force of frightening intensity. 300 years of humiliation, abuse, deprivation cannot be expected to find voice in a whisper. There are those who see an equivalency between the civil rights protests of the 1960s and of the last year and what happened in the Capitol last week. There is no equivalency. More on that later. Dr. King is most famous for his dreams. Specifically, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Most of us know that sentence by heart. It is perhaps one of the most famous sentences in the history of our country. Those words have and had the power to distill the absurdity, the injustice of racism. Chris Harrison, who is editor of the Reform Movement's Audacious Hospitality blog, writes that on this Shabbat, he encourages you to study the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., all of it, not just his palatable I have a dream side, and not only the side on which Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel stands beside him. Study and emulate the parts of his work that may make you uncomfortable, so that we truly can follow our sacred tradition's imperative to pursue justice. Only then will we make Dr. King's vision a reality. Why is Dr. King's dream the most famous sentence in American history? Because it does not make anyone, save for the most vile of racists, feel uncomfortable. His other dreams do that are in that speech. Specifically, he picks out the sweltering heat of injustice in Mississippi and the vicious racists of Alabama. But most Americans did not and do not live in Mississippi or Alabama. Dr. King didn't have any dreams about the inequalities rampant throughout the rest of the country. If he had called us out, all of us, everywhere, would we still be quoting this speech? Or would it be like the mountains of the writings of a man we profess to honor but would prefer not to read, at least not too closely, lest we find something that makes us uncomfortable? In his book, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King writes, The Negro also had to recognize that 100 years after emancipation, he lived on a lonely island of economic insecurity in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Negroes are still at the bottom of the economic ladder. They live within two concentric circles of segregation. One imprisons them on the basis of color, while the other confines them within a separate culture of poverty. He is deprived of normal education and normal social and economic opportunities, and when he seeks opportunity, he is told, in effect, to lift himself up by his bootstraps, as advice which does not take into account the fact that he is barefoot. Dr. King chooses the passive voice. The Black person is deprived, is told. But who exactly is doing that depriving? Who is doing that telling? Who is responsible for that man being barefoot? Who is too oblivious, too unconcerned to even notice? Today, the average Black worker earns about 63% of what the average white worker earns. The average white household has a net worth of just under $163,000. The average Black household, $16,000, less than 10%. Education, that is the answer that is supposed to fix all of this. A college degree is the best bootstrap we have. Yet a Black household with at least one college-educated worker earns 68% of what a white household with no college education earns. Let me repeat that. The net worth of a Black person who goes to college is 32% less than that of a white person who does not. What would Dr. King have to say about that if he was alive today? And would we be able to listen? It is one thing to hear criticisms of racists who lived in a different time and in a different place. It is another entirely to have to hold that mirror up to ourselves. The uncomfortable truth Chris Harrison urges us to consider is this: we, as a society, are responsible for these statistics. They exist because of history and because of public policy. Policy that many of us benefit from, that I have benefited from and done absolutely nothing to deserve. Policies that I continue to benefit from at someone else's expense. Yes, I like to think I have worked hard to get where I am, but that doesn't mean others haven't worked far harder and received far less. Both of those statements can be true at the same time. This year, as we observe the day dedicated to his memory, let us ask the question, what would it be that Dr. King would want us to do on this day? Would he be content with meaningful but day-long volunteer projects, with thoughtful Facebook posts? We are a long way from a just society. It will not be any of us alone who get us there, but we can and must start by acknowledging the obvious yet somehow still controversial truth that injustice exists and that it has benefited many of us. Acknowledging that for all our talk of justice, our actions are not always in line. That is uncomfortable. That is what Dr. King would want and most likely demand. A day in his honor where we ignore the bulk of his message, that is no honor. And for those who see parallels between Dr. King's work and the civil rights movement, which included countless other volunteers whose names we don't know, who don't have holidays in their honor, those who would equate that movement and what happened with the undemocratic mobs last week, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism issued the following statement on behalf of the Reform movement and the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the rabbinic union that all three of your temple clergy rabbis are members of. I will read selections of the statement, which is also available online. White nationalists, some of whom were carrying Confederate flags or wearing anti-Semitic t-shirts, were not just protesting. They were attacking our government to stop a democratic process from taking place. Sadly, one of the most disingenuous responses to yesterday's events was to create a false moral equivalence with the Black Lives Matter protests over the last year. Let's be clear. The white nationalists were attempting to undermine our government while Black Lives Matter protesters were demanding to be included in our democracy. The difference between the summer's events and the response to yesterday's violent, seditious attack on the Capitol building is a shocking but unsurprising example of systemic, hypocritical racism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. The lessons of yesterday's events will be studied for generations, but one is already clear. White proponents of lies about stolen elections get a very different response than do condemnations of real, ongoing systemic racism that results in the disproportionate killings of people of color, and men in particular. Yesterday's mob was not a group of protesters. They were, at best, insurrectionists. They shook our democracy to its core. Never before has the world seen the U.S. Capitol stormed by a group determined to supplant the will of American voters as expressed at the ballot box with their own. But yesterday we saw once again the power of white privilege. Shabbat Tzedek, Justice Shabbat, calls on us to recognize what justice looks like and to be honest about how far short we have fallen. Shabbat Tzedek calls on us to be brave, to say what is true even if it is uncomfortable. And it requires that we call out false equivalencies. I am sure the statement I shared came at some expense. And yet I am proud to belong to a movement that did not hesitate for a moment to issue it. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.